Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
Back in 2018, a female pastor named Gretta Vosper, who served in the United Church of Canada, which is the largest Christian denomination in Canada, well, she made headlines when her denomination put her under an official review for being an atheist. Do you hear that? She was a pastor and did not believe in God. Well, sadly, this wasn't new. She'd actually come out as an atheist 15 years earlier, back in 2003, but it took 15 years for her denomination to officially respond. Listen to her position on why she believes she should stay a pastor despite not believing. Watch this.
This idea that there is this being that is, to whom we are offering our praise and our worship. What are we doing? What is church about?
What is church about for you?
Well, for me, church is about the ultimate end of it is creating healthy communities. I was in a Facebook back and forth with one of my colleagues the other day, and I made a remark about, that God that I don't believe in, that no one else says they believe in, because people are regularly saying that to me, and he said, I don't know anyone who believes in the God you don't believe in. You can't talk about this stuff down here because you'll threaten people's worldviews. Well, we've grown up. We're not that fragile anymore. Like, we can talk about these things. Facebook, it's all over Facebook, it's all over the internet. People are having these conversations. Why do we have to pretend that they can't deal with a difficult conversation? God, as source of goodness, and as the way that goodness comes into the world, and as the promise that everything's going to be good in the end, whether in this lifetime or the afterlife, that God doesn't exist anymore. And we have to recognize that we're the only way that goodness is going to get into this world. And we define what's good. What's good in one community won't be good in another. We define it, so we're the creators of good. This is my United Church. I grew up in this church. I ran out my backyard and crossed the street to go to church as a kid. I got confirmed in the United Church. I taught confirmation classes when I was at university. I engaged. And then I went back to theological college as a single mom to do this work, and because I believed in my church.
So what's going to happen now? What if they don't want you? What if they decide that you're not fit to be a minister here?
Well, I'll be really sad that my fitness for ministry is based entirely on whether or not I can affirm an archaic doctrinal statement that describes God in a way that is incomprehensible.
Well, it's now a few years later, so we know what happened. We know how our denomination responded. The denomination felt it wasn't worth the fight, and they actually gave her full approval to continue as a pastor despite not believing that God exists. Here's what happened. In November 2018, before the hearing could take place, Vosper and the United Church of Canada reached a settlement that allowed her to continue as a pastor, effectively ending the matter. Her lawyer, Julian Falconer, offered this comment. Both parties took a long look at the cost benefit at running a heresy trial and whether it was good for anyone. And the results speak for themselves. Here's the results. She went on to write a best-selling book spewing her ignorance. It's just heartbreaking. It's absolutely tragic, because here's a woman so completely narcissistic, so deceived, so naive, so full of herself that she believes you don't need God in order to play church. My question for her would be, well, why not? If it's just about relationships with people, why not just start a community program? Why a church? The answer is because the heart of all humans are saturated with self. It's all about me, mine, I. Did you count how many times in her interview she said the word I or me? Of course she has no room for God because she's too full of herself. In fact, she's no different than the rest of humanity. Mankind has been trying to prove they don't need God since the Garden of Eden. In fact, last week we met a man who lived over 4,000 years ago whose very name means rebel. And we're going to look in this study at the results of his rebellious heart. And just like the Reverend Gretta Vosper, he tried to lead people into believing they didn't need God to make it in life. And through this study, we'll learn an important lesson. Don't be a Nimrod. Again, as we learned last time, when we think of a Nimrod in today's culture, we think of an idiot, someone foolish. However, as we continue to study life after the flood in Genesis chapter 11, in that society, they didn't think of a fool when they heard the name Nimrod. They thought of this, a mighty warrior, a mighty hunter before God. Because the name Nimrod doesn't mean moron. The name Nimrod means rebel. So don't be a Nimrod. Don't be a rebel. Let's pick it up where we left off last time in Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. So humankind had one language, a common speech. To really grasp the beauty of this passage, we have to understand what language is in the concept of mutual intelligibility, or the ability to understand each other without prior familiarity or special effort. In this example, person 1 comes into contact with person 2. Person 1 is able to speak with person 2 and be understood by person 2. It's true in reverse as well. Person 2 is able to speak with person 1 and understood by person number 1. In other words, the two people can mutually speak with and understand each other with mutual intelligibility. In other words, they jointly speak in what we call a language. If person number 3 comes into the conversation, that person meets both speakers 1 and 2 and is able to speak with and be understood by both 1 and 2, then all 3 share mutual intelligibility and they share a common language. Now, let's say that all 3 are from the United States and the language they speak is English. Then all 3, person 1, 2, and 3, they travel to a new area, to a new region of the world. Let's say they travel to Australia. Now they can understand the people and be understood by the people in that new region, but the speech, it differs somewhat. They would share mutual intelligibility with English speakers in Australia, but it'd be slightly different with the same language with different pronunciations and sometimes different meanings for the same words. While they all speak the same language, the 3 would discover that the people in that new region have a different dialect. If they all 3 left Australia and they traveled to China and they met people who didn't speak English, there would be no mutual intelligibility because obviously they cannot speak or understand each other because they speak different languages. Now today on the planet Earth, there's about 6,000 languages spoken around this globe. And these languages, they don't differ from each other randomly. Instead, languages are related to each other and some have shared alphabets, some completely unique. But these 6,000 languages have evolved and developed over thousands of years. Language works a lot like the genetic relationships we studied back in the Table of Nations back in the last chapter, Genesis chapter 10. Actually, you can map language groups like family trees. The science of historical linguistics, what they do is they compare multiple languages and see how they are interrelated to each other, how they're unique, and how they developed over thousands of years to the 6,000 languages humans speak on earth today. But according to verse 1 here in Genesis chapter 11, we don't have a tree with branches. All they had here after the flood was one trunk, which meant they didn't really have mutual intelligibility, but complete intelligibility, regardless of where one was born from. And as we dig in here to Genesis chapter 11, we're going to see God separate that one trunk and then plant the saplings that spread out to become the 6,000 languages we have on earth today. Well, verse 2, as people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Don't forget where we're starting from. The 8 surviving humans after the flood that got off the ark in the mountains of Ararat, a region in eastern Turkey today, or Iran. And they moved eastward and found a plain in Shinar, which would be modern-day Iraq near the Persian Gulf. They settled down there. Now, don't lose perspective here. The whole world, it's one family. This is only 3 or 4 generations after the flood. In fact, Noah himself is likely among them as a patriarch figure. Interesting that this first plain that they settled on today has 2 rivers named after 2 of the 4 rivers that we know existed before the flood, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Despite the topography of the earth being radically transformed during the flood, they still held on to those pre-flood river names, which is why they're still called that to this day. But there's one huge problem with all their moving together and settling in this new home. They were in direct rebellion to God. Do you remember what God said when they got off the ark? Remember this? Genesis chapter 9, verse 1? Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. And then he repeated it again to make sure they got it in verse 7. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number. Multiply on the earth and increase upon it. Echoing back to what God first commanded Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 1. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. God wanted them to spread around the entire earth, to have lots and lots of babies, and to spread apart and fill the entire earth that God had created for them. But what'd they say? Nope. We're staying here as one family, one people on this warm, fertile plain next to the sea. They were in direct rebellion against the command of God. They found a home on this plain of Shinar. Well, question, who grew his kingdom here? Remember what we learned in chapter 10? It was Nimrod, the rebel. Genesis 10:10. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. Nimrod was called the rebel. Who was he rebelling against? It was God. He was a rebel against God's command, saying, no, God, we're staying right here. Don't be a Nimrod. Back to chapter 11, verse 3. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar, which is exactly the style of ancient building techniques that we find in the archaeological ruins on the plain of Shinar today. This is history, not just mythology. This actually happened, and the archaeological evidence confirms it. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. And here we find their motivation. This is open rebellion against God's command. They demanded independence from God and launched an uprising of humanity against the Lord. This was unadulterated pride, spitting in God's face and in his command. Humility, it's about trust and obedience. Well, conversely, pride is related to independence and disobedience. They could have cared less about following God, who had chosen them and had saved their specific family out of all the families on earth in the person of Noah, out of the whole world. And God chose them and saved them through Noah's obedience and on the ark. Yet just a few generations after, they were once again, just like before the flood, saturated with self, with me, mine, not God. We don't need God. Kind of like the Reverend Gretta Vosper. She doesn't need God. In her vast experience, she doesn't even know anyone who still believes in some archaic God who somehow exists. I'd just say to Reverend Gretta, don't be a Nimrod. What's ironic is that people like Reverend Gretta, or those barricading themselves on the plain of Shinar, well, we naturally tend to think that God is somehow against us, that he doesn't have our best interest in mind. But think about what these Nimrods were rebelling against. The Creator God, the God of wonders of all the earth, he had it all waiting out there for them to discover. From the depths of the sea to the wonders of Yellowstone, to the Himalayas, to the Rocky Mountains. They're there dug in, refusing to budge, when God had prepared for them all of the wonders of the earth for them to enjoy as a gift from him. He simply said, go, scattered. They said no, because of their rebellious hearts. It's just tragic. It's so foolish, yet it's so similar to our hearts towards God today. Verse 5, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. God recognizes the strength of humans that united them in rebellion. It was their mutual intelligibility. That one trunk of the tree of language where everyone was able to easily speak and understand each other. Language enabled them to communicate, strategize, build, unite, rise up, and rebel. In their pride, they believed they could stand up to their Creator. And so as the ultimate spit in God's face move, they decide to build a city with a tower that reaches the heavens. And don't miss this practical move it was for humans to build a tower. Yes, their motive was pride and self, to make a name for themselves. But the practical move here was to build a tower to protect themselves against God's retribution if he decided to send another flood. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, he wrote about this. Look at this from his book, The Antiquities of the Jews. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it was through his means that they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence upon his power. He also said he would revenge on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. They were a bunch of Nimrods, rebelling against God, following after a leader, a man named Rebel or Nimrod. Verse 7, come, let us. Now notice when God speaks to himself, it's always plural, reflecting the triune nature of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. God said, go, scatter, discover the earth, fill it. They said, nope, and they dug in their heels. So what did God do? Did he send another flood to wipe out these Nimrods? Nope. He promised never again to flood the entire earth and sent the rainbow as a reminder of that promise. Instead, with a flick of his fingers, he crushed their strength, their complete intelligibility. Not just their complete intelligibility, but their mutual intelligibility. But remember, this is just 3 to 4 generations of a family, a glorified family reunion here. They just happen to be the only living human beings on the planet. But imagine in an instant going from freely talking and enjoying each other as a family to not being able to understand a word. And in a sense, God chopped down the one trunk of language and made it into saplings that would spread around the earth. Don't miss the beauty of this. God used man's rebellion to spread them and scatter those saplings of language across the earth. That includes Noah and his wife. I mean, they're still alive here, and they were scattered. Nimrod, he stays there on the plain of Shinar, probably because he was the biggest and strongest and made everyone else move and scatter away from him. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. God commanded them to scatter and fill the earth. They thought they were more powerful and important and bigger than God in their unity, and that they could build a tower so high God couldn't touch them with the flood. So with the snap of his fingers, God took away their strength. That spirit of rebellion that's in the great rebel Nimrod, that same spirit of rebellion that's in that false pastor, Reverend Gretta, that says, it's all about me. I have no need of God. Well, reality is different. To both Nimrod and Gretta, reality says, regardless of what we believe, it's all about God. Their language was one trunk. When God created multiple saplings and took them from their heels dug in circumstances there on the plain of Shinar and scattered them across the face of the earth. I want to close by just focusing on the wonder of God in all this. I got this map of human migration from National Geographic, which describes how historical linguists have found languages developed around the world. And if you want to know why this map of human migration exists, well, this is why. God transformed their rebellion into wonder. And linguistic historians and anthropologists, they're just discovering glimpses of this reality as they study the migration away from modern-day Iraq, exactly as the Bible describes. But I want to focus down on one very significant limb of the Earth language family tree to illustrate God's wonder in all this. And that's in the oldest pictorial language that is still used on Earth today, the Chinese language. Now this is a language spoken by a culture that we know has existed for 4,500 years. That's unbroken civilization. That takes the Chinese civilization right back to the decades following Genesis chapter 11. And for the first 2,000 years of that civilization, they were completely isolated from the rest of the earth. So the obvious question is, might they have record of a Tower of Babel event? Or of a flood of Noah, or of the Garden of Eden? Kind of a big deal if you think about the reality that Chinese also happens to be the #1 most spoken language on the face of the planet today. Well, a funny thing happened in the 18th and 19th centuries when Christian missionaries in China began to learn and translate the Bible into the Chinese language. They discovered a few things. First, they learned that for the first 2,500 years of Chinese civilization, it wasn't polytheistic. It was monotheistic. The Chinese people, they were monotheistic, and they worshiped and sacrificed to the one true creator God they called Shang-Ti, until about the 5th century BC when Confucius came on scene. Then they discovered something even more wondrous. The book of Genesis, it's everywhere in the Chinese language. What you need to understand is that Chinese is a semi-pictorial language. The Chinese characters are made up of pictures or symbols of other words that signify or communicate what that word means. How is Genesis found in the Chinese language? Well, here's a few examples. The word create is made up of 4 symbols: speak, dust or mud, life, and the symbol for walk. Put together to understand the word create in Chinese is that someone spoke and created life who walked out of dust. Kind of sounds like Genesis chapter 2. But look at this word. The word garden is made up of the symbols for dust, breath, 2 persons, and enclosed. Obviously, right out of Genesis 2 and chapter 3, where God created 2 persons, out of the dust of the earth and breathed life into them and placed them in an enclosure called a garden. Then the word for tempter. Now this one's even more complicated because there's more symbols. The word tempter is first made up of the word for devil, which is made up of the symbols for secret, man, garden, alive. And then that word devil is combined with the symbols for trees and cover to make the word tempter. The word forbidden or to warn is made up of the symbols for two trees and God. The word for to covet or desire is made up of the symbols for two trees and woman. The word for boat is made up of the symbols for vessel, eight, and people. How many people were on board Noah's Ark? We had Noah, his wife, 3 sons, and their wives. That's 8. So every time you see a Chinese boat, even to this day, it points right back to Genesis. Then you get the word for tower, which, if you haven't noticed, China has built a lot of towers over the past decade. Every tower that the Chinese Communist Party has built, it's a statement of the book of Genesis, because the word for tower is made up of the symbols for undertaking and united, just like we read in Genesis 11. The word for confusion is made up of the symbols for tongue and mystery, where suddenly you cannot understand what another person is saying because their language, their tongue, is a mystery. And the last word we'll look at for this study is the Chinese word for scatter, which is made up of the symbols for all, flesh, and go, just like we read about in Genesis chapter 11. So why is the book of Genesis found everywhere in the Chinese language? Because over 4,500 years ago, at least one person walked away from a failed tower project on the plain of Shinar speaking Chinese. Those people made their ways to Asia, where they started a civilization that has endured to this day in 2025. And the echoes of what they experienced long ago is now clearly protected and kept in the most spoken language on earth. It's no wonder why China is one of the fastest growing people groups on earth in finding Jesus Christ as their Savior. God protected His truth for 4,500 years in their very words.